Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research. We're about CESPA. It's an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore and studies contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. Now, at the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, which was in late 1978, China embarked on an open-door policy under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. The policy was grounded in the idea of achieving economic growth through the active introduction of foreign capital and technology while maintaining China's commitment to socialism. The policy also rested on what came to be known as four modernizations. These modernizations, or reforms, if you will, focused on bringing the areas of agriculture, industry, science and technology, and the military up to modern global standards. Deng also believed in staying below the radar. Now, China has come a long way since then. It is no more below the radar. It seeks, by the statements of its current leaders, to stake a claim to global leadership which is commensurate with its economic, technological, and military heft. Today's episode, however, focuses on China's nuclear strategy and thinking. Does China have a different philosophy when it comes to developing nuclear weapons capabilities and, of course, also their employment? China has also been committed to no first use, and in February this year, Sun Xiaobo, the Director General of the Department of Arms Control in China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, once again called on nuclear weapon states, and this is his speech at the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva, and he said, and I quote, to negotiate and conclude a treaty on mutual no first use of nuclear weapons, or issue political statements in this regard. Now, how does this square with reports that China has been increasing the quantity and quality of its nuclear warheads and delivery systems? To discuss all this, I have with me Dr. Tong Zhao, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is formerly based in Beijing. He now conducts research in Washington on a very broad range of strategic security issues. He holds a PhD in science, technology, and international affairs from Georgia Institute of Technology, and is the author of Tides of Change, China's Nuclear Ballistic Missile Submarines and Strategic Stability, and Narrowing the US-China Gap on Missile Defense, How to Help Forestall a Nuclear Arms Race. He also edited a book with Fissile on China's nuclear thinking. So, great to have you, Professor Zhao. Let's begin with something that, and I'm actually quoting from the first chapter of this edited book that you edited with Libin. And Libin spoke about China's approach, and he said, as far as China is concerned, what is important is ensuring that it has the technological leeway to avoid being caught off guard by new innovations. And then he goes on to say that this is something that the US scholars and policy wonks cannot comprehend. I also found, as I went through the edited volume, that this is a motif that keeps coming up. This is also something that you talk about in your epilogue in that edited volume. I want to understand, and I'm sure our viewers would also want to understand, what exactly does this mean? Or to put it in a different way, how does China's pursuit of technological nuances and advancements not give a sense of threat perception to a peer competitor?
I think for the last few, well, first of all, it's a real honor to be here. And to answer your question, I think for the past decades, at the technical level, China has been concerned about the technological advancements in U.S. strategic military capabilities. Some of those relate to improvement of the accuracy of U.S. nuclear missiles, which would increase their counterforce capability against China's small nuclear arsenal. But most of those are about non-nuclear strategic technologies that could undermine China's nuclear deterrence in one way or another. Among those, missile defense is a primary concern. And this is because China always uses worst-case scenario thinking in calculating its nuclear survivability and the effectiveness of its second strike. China assumes that the United States might start with a comprehensive disarming first strike, using all available military capabilities, nuclear and conventional. As a result, only a small number of Chinese nuclear weapons might survive, and therefore even a small-sized homeland missile defense system might fully neutralize Chinese capability to retaliate. But there are other concerns in addition to missile defense. The most recent improvement.
Before we go to the other concerns, let me just pick up on this missile defense thing. Now, one of the things that we know from statements by the Chinese officials and also Chinese scholars, China does not have a hair trigger alert. China does not really think in terms of launch on warning as the United States did and still does, or the Soviet Union did, and Russia still does. It does not even, it's not wedded to launch under attack. Its philosophy is rooted in launch after attack. Now, if that is correct, then given China's landmass and given China's second strike capability, how does a ballistic or cruise missile defense become one of the primary concerns? Of course, not the only concern, but one of the primary concerns.
Well, I think the longstanding Chinese concern is the U.S. has a superior surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities. Even though China has taken measures to put its missiles on mobile systems, and China has made real efforts to hide and conceal its nuclear weapon systems. China has spent a lot of money building the so-called underground Great Wall, extensive underground tunnel systems that could protect some of the nuclear assets at a time of crisis. And in theory, those mobile systems in particular should be quite survivable and make it really hard for the US to preemptively target, track, and destroy Chinese nuclear assets. However, I think Chinese military is constantly worried that ever-improving US surveillance capability, especially space-based sensors. In recent years, the US has been developing new types of proliferated low-orbit sensors, numerous sensors, that increasingly give the United States the capability to identify, track, and potentially target Chinese road mobile missile vehicles and their enabling capabilities. So I think China starts to worry that over time, the US will be able to figure out the patterns of Chinese road mobile missile deployment. China also has fake missile silos in order to confuse the US military. But again, over time,
Okay.
I think there is concern that the fake missile silos will be picked out. So there is declining confidence on the Chinese side on the credibility of its nuclear deterrence.
So you're basically saying, and we'll get to the other concerns that you were talking about, that the primary thinking in China is that in case of a U.S. strike, and I'm assuming because China is not going to initiate a strike, the strike will be initiated by the United States, that it will essentially be counterforce targeting?
I think China assumes the U.S. Is contemplating counterforce targeting against China, but in terms of China's targeting strategy for itself in the nuclear retaliation, it appears to be a mixture of counter value and counter force. Counter value in the sense that small nuclear arsenal cannot achieve an effective disarming counter force strike. So it makes most sense for China to inflict the greatest damage and destruction on the American society. So I'm sure some major US cities and population centers, major civilian infrastructures will be included in this counter value targeting strategy. But I think Chinese military also increasingly talking about importance of conducting a keynote strike, strike against a strategic enemy targets. I think those are referring to potential strategic command and control centers of the U.S. military. But we really don't know the specifics. There is very limited open source information on that.
But this is very interesting because if the thinking on the Chinese side is that the United States a putative U.S. strike is going to be essentially counterforce, but because China has a smaller nuclear force, it won't be able to. A counterforce strike is not going to inflict the kind of pain that China would want to inflict in retaliation, and therefore China will go for a counter value strike, and that presumably should be a deterrent against a U.S. strike. Now, here's the thing. One of the things that comes out in your edited volume has to do with a slight difference between how the United States analyzes a situation or threat perception in terms of capabilities and intentions, and how China does that, which is that China's threat perception is more situational and not exactly grounded in capabilities and intentions. So that's one thing. Although there can be an overlap. And secondly, China does not look at the threat perceptions only in terms of external enemies, but also in terms of internal dynamics, which can have an impact on the governmental system, on society, essentially internal disruptions. But let's leave the internal side aside. If the Chinese thinking is that at some point there could be a sort of armed conflict with the United States, and there's a possibility of the U.S. striking China or Chinese military infrastructure and command and control centers and the rest of it. How is this different from the threat analysis that the Americans do, which is that you're looking at the capabilities also, and you're looking at possible intent also?
Yes, I think that's a key challenge facing the U.S.-China nuclear relationship. China, I will not go into too much detail for now, but I do think the Chinese threat perception is increasingly at the political and the strategic level. And China is looking at U.S. behaviors towards China comprehensively. Because on the nuclear side, there isn't much U.S. Activity. Yes, U.S. has been upgrading its nuclear and non-nuclear strategic capabilities over time, but that modernization process on the American side is generally transparent, gradualistic, and predictable. So I don't think U.S. improvement of nuclear missile defense and conventional strike capabilities can fully account for the scope and scale of China's relatively abrupt nuclear expansion program. So I was increasingly convinced that the Chinese recent nuclear buildup has more to do with China's overall threat perception about the United States in terms of, Beijing has been saying quite a lot recently that the US has adopted a more hostile policy towards China, especially during the Trump administration. The Beijing's threat perception has reached a level that China thinks the US is again interested in regime change. So China felt a level of existential threat from Washington. And somehow China's leadership appears to believe that by demonstrating stronger military power, especially nuclear capability, China could influence the American decision makers' perception of the relative balance of power between the two sides. And since the United States recognizes power more than anything else, if China can convince the United States that the balance of power is already shifting against Americans' favor, and there is no utility for the US to try to contain China and disrupt China's growth, then the US would have to accept the new reality of a risen China and therefore accept China, respect China's core interests and treat China more equally. I think that's how, in the mind of China's leadership, they view the value of a bigger nuclear arsenal. So they still think the Chinese nuclear buildup could be stabilizing because it would make the United States behave more cautiously when dealing with China. But as you said, on the American side, they don't necessarily understand this philosophical thinking in China, and they are looking at the outcome of Chinese buildup. They're looking at the number of new systems, the types of new capabilities, and they indeed worry all these new capabilities could present a new nuclear threat. China might even intend to conduct some counter-force strike against the United States. China might intend to use nuclear weapons earlier in a future conflict. So there is a growing gap in the bilateral threat perception, and you are exactly right. I think that presents a real challenge to the bilateral nuclear stability.
Right. So one of the things that, which is very obvious, the bilateral arms control measures between China and the Russian, between the United States and the Russian Federation have basically unraveled. But the United States has also been trying to approach China for some kind of bilateral or a trilateral arrangement, which China has so far not really shown much interest in. But this thinking in China, and I'm kind of giving you a counterpoint on this. This thinking in China that with China's greater power projection, the United States will be deterred, that kind of flies in the face of structural realism. Because peer competition, as Professor Mearsheimer wrote many years ago, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, that the United States is going to double down and make sure that China doesn't get to that. Now, this kind of links up with China's desire to have the technological edge. And we have already seen that the United States is doing everything possible that it can to deny China, for instance, cutting-edge semiconductors. So this is only going to get into a spiral. That's one of my observations. The second is, and I want to actually quote from what you wrote, and you talking about the fact that if a country adopts a launch and warning posture, its top leadership must make a quick decision about whether to launch a nuclear counterattack immediately after receiving a warning signal. And then I'm skipping to the next paragraph where you say, unlike the United States and Russia and previously the Soviet Union, China has never subscribed to this nuclear weapon deployment posture, Studies show that China's nuclear weapons are put on low alert in peacetime, with warheads unmated from missiles and stored in separate locations. Now, it seems to me that that thinking in China is undergoing a change.
Yes, indeed. When it comes to the alert status of Chinese nuclear forces, there is a wide range of activities undertaken at this moment. They We know that China is already putting into place a comprehensive capability to provide Chinese nuclear forces with strategic early warning. And these include both space-based early warning satellites. China already has at least 2 early warning satellites in orbit, if not more. China has constructed several large ground-based early warning radars across the country. To be fair, this early warning capability does not necessarily mean China has made a decision to transition towards launch under attack or launch on warning, because China can use the early warning data to also construct its own missile defense capability. But we do see Chinese military becoming more interested in the idea of launch under attack. And they have been arguing that launch under attack would not violate China's longstanding no first use policy. And most importantly, a couple of American researchers, including Dr. Gregory Gulicki from the Union of Concerned Scientists, they dug out some internal speeches made by President Xi Jinping early in his tenure. And he gave very specific instructions to the officials of China's missile forces that they need to enhance the alert status of China's missile forces. And throughout the years, the military has been emphasizing the capability of rapid response. And a recently retired senior colonel from the Rocket Force said in around 2020 that China already had the capability to retaliate within minutes after detecting an incoming enemy missile attack. So there appears to be important movement in this area. Again, China may not have made the official decision to adopt launch under attack posture, but it's certainly moving towards acquiring that capability. But once the capability is ready, I think it makes it easier for the leadership to eventually decide on officially adopting a posture.
Now, let me just talk about briefly about the ballistic and cruise missile defenses before I go to the internal dynamics. Now, we have come a long way in terms of technology from the 90s, and with this hit-to-kill vehicles, which are also exo-atmospheric, there has been a lot of improvement in terms of interdiction of incoming ballistic and cruise missiles. But at the same time, no defensive system can have a 100% kill ratio. And if you're talking about strategic warheads, and I can give you a recent example, when Iran decided to launch an attack on Israel, it did so in a band where the United States intelligence, the intelligence agencies of its allies, the Israeli intelligence, everyone knew that the attack would be coming. But Iran, that wasn't really Iran's concern. What I'm trying to say is that at that point in time, some of the best systems in the world were there to basically interdict Iranian missiles. And yet, by all indications, the 99% exaggeration, leaving that aside, at least 7 to 8 missiles got through that shield and hit the Ramon Air Base also, and one of their intelligence headquarters also. Now, the issue is that if these missiles had strategic warheads, they would have been enough to cause immense destruction. And I think that is a lesson that has been learned by the United States and Israel also. My point being that at the end of the day, if state X is firing strategic warheads against state Y, you don't need all of them to get in. So that's one thing about ballistic missile and cruise missile. And the second thing is that we now have these hypersonic missiles, and we are now putting the artificial intelligence into the kill chain. I want to understand, given your expertise and your technical background, of how you think that changes the dynamics of missile defenses also.
Yeah, this is a great question. The recent conflict in Ukraine, in the Middle East, will certainly ignite a new round of debates about the technological feasibility of missile defense. In terms of U.S.-China, I think we face a number of challenges. One is, again, I don't think the U.S. is intent on intercepting a massive Chinese nuclear retaliation. The debate in Washington is more interested in intercepting a small number of Chinese launches in so-called coercive strike from near peers like China and Russia. If if a conventional regional war between U.S. and China escalates to higher level, and China starts to shoot a very small number of intercontinental range missiles towards the United States, the United States wants to be able to intercept that. That interest is further strengthened by the perceived Chinese development of conventional intercontinental range missile capabilities. There's a lot of attention on this in Washington, and that complicates the American thinking in the sense that if China might escalate a war by using conventional long-range missiles to strike U.S. homeland, the U.S. should have every reason to intercept that. So I think that strengthens the American interest in intercepting a small number of strategic missile strike. But that creates the same concern in China about the credibility of its nuclear second strike, because again, China thinks it is likely to have to absorb a disarming American first strike in a major war. So only a small number of nuclear weapons will survive. So the U.S. capability to intercept limited Chinese strike can already neutralize Chinese nuclear second strike capability. And you mentioned new technologies like hypersonic missiles. That's again a key debate right now. China has been developing hypersonic missiles primarily because of concern of U.S. missile defense, and the perceived capacity of hypersonic missiles to penetrate traditional ballistic missile defense is viewed as the key advantage of such weapon system in Beijing. The reported testing of China in 2021 of a so-called FOBS weapon system, basically China sent a weapon into orbit and deorbited it, and then released a hypersonic glider weapon to strike an enemy target. I think that long-range weapon system could be another Chinese attempt to ensure its limited attack on the U.S. homeland would be able to penetrate missile defense. However, the technological development shows that the U.S. can also increasingly find vulnerabilities in these new highly penetrating weapon systems. The US efforts to develop defensive capabilities against hypersonic missiles focus in particular in the maneuvering phase of a glider vehicle. And
Right.
also, a glider needs to slow down significantly when it closes in on the target. So that's also a vulnerable period when even a short-range terminal missile defense system might engage a glider weapon. So it looks like a constant offense-defense competition is now clear.
Yeah,
One side has a clear advantage.
the entire history of warfare is about this dialectic between the offensive and defensive system. But now that we're moving towards the closing of the program, I want to focus on something slightly different. Now, China has never gone into these hotspots around the world. China hasn't been bombing countries. China hasn't been doing any of the stuff that the United States does so often, and is constantly proven to be pretty bad at it at the end of the day. But within its own neighborhood, and I'm talking about East China Sea, I'm talking about South China Sea, China seems to be now moving towards some kind of Chinese Monroe Doctrine, with a 9-dash line, and problems with the Philippines, and of course China's assertion that Taiwan is a part of China. This is the unfinished civil war agenda that needs to be brought to a closure. Now, my point is that and Chinese strategic thinking also is in situational terms looks at these issues as those particular situations that can be harmful for China. Now, my point is that while on the one hand China is looking for partners, why would China, I mean, in the sense that most of Taiwanese investments are in the Chinese economy. China is Taiwan's biggest trading partner. Similarly, the countries in South China Sea would never do, I mean, they just don't have the capability to challenge China, but they do have their genuine interests in terms of territories within South China Sea, and the 9-dash line is something that makes them very nervous. Vietnam and the Philippines stand out. Now, China, I know, has tried in the past and is still trying to figure out some kind of balance there, but it hasn't been able to do that because it front loads those negotiations with the claim to the 9-dash line. So I want to get your opinion on how China should play its hand, and whether one is right in assuming that China might be projecting power in a way that is making those states nervous, and that actually redounds to China's disadvantage.
I very much agree with you. I think China has this very strong conviction that it has the right to defend its perceived territorial interests in over Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, and East China Sea. And given China's 100 years history of national humiliation, I understand why China thinks so strongly about its right to defend, and especially as China becomes more materially stronger, China thinks it's time for China to put use of its capability to defend its territorial claim. But it does create genuine threat perception in regional countries to the detriment of China. Because when regional countries, including US allies, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, they become more worried about China's conventional level military aggression, they increasingly oppose US consideration and adoption of no first use policy, something that China really wants to achieve. So it's against China's other strategic interests. It undermines also the nuclear level stability between US and China. So China, I think, needs to provide some conventional level security reassurance to regional countries. Personally, if I'm, have a say, I would, encourage China to commit to a common sense principle of not using force to change territorial status quo. If China thinks its power is growing, including its soft power, it should be able to persuade Taiwan to, feel attracted to the mainland and be willing to incorporate more closely with the mainland. It shouldn't need to resort to force to achieve that goal.
The reason correct. The reason I asked this is that back in 2004, I was in Shanghai at the invitation of the Fudan University. So I was just going around and talking to lots of people, and I realized that a lot of real estate in Shanghai was owned by Taiwanese, and there were lots of Taiwanese businesses in Shanghai and also in southern China. And it seemed to me that Taiwan is already entwined so closely into Chinese economy that the idea of actually invading Taiwan and upsetting the apple cart seemed to me a somewhat strange idea, because you already have Taiwan in your fist, so to speak. Ditto for other countries in the region that happily would want to trade with China, and they do. And there's the huge Chinese market, and for Chinese goods, there are other markets. So it seems to me that projection of power in this kind of way is actually driving these countries towards the United States rather than pulling them away from the United States.
Indeed. I think China's impressive military modernization, coupled with China's explicit rejection of the renunciation of use of force to resolve the disputes, create a lot of genuine threat perception, and that gives the U.S. excuse to rally other countries against China. I think it's time for Beijing to seriously consider what it can do to reassure regional countries at the conventional military level.
Right. Now, Professor Zhao, one final question, and this is kind of circling back to the nuclear thinking and no first use. Now, this Assistant Secretary of State Mallory Stewart heads the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability. She gave an interview last month, and she indicated that for the first time, the United States is open to considering a proposal by China that nuclear weapons states negotiate a treaty on the no first use of nuclear weapons. But she also stated, and this is where she talked about China's constant development of its nuclear warheads and delivery systems, both qualitatively and quantitatively, that she would love to ask Chinese officials how this development squares with the idea of a multilateral no first use treaty. So I just want to get your sense on that before I close this program.
I think that's a positive signal from Washington. China has long promoted no first use, but really incentivized its efforts to promote it in recent year. And I think on one hand, China genuinely believes that no first use is a necessary step towards reducing the role of nuclear weapons, and therefore towards achieving real progress on disarmament and arms control. But on the other hand, China understands, U.S. faces real difficulty adopting no first use, and therefore playing this card helps enhance China's international image. But I do think the two sides can have some mutually beneficial discussions on this topic because they both face the issue of credibility. The US doesn't trust the credibility of China's no first use declaration. And you know what? When President Obama and Biden expressed a certain interest in American no first use, at that time, the Chinese experts' reaction to that was quite skeptical. So China wouldn't necessarily
Yes,
trust American no first use.
I come across a number of analyses within the United States policy community and also academic community that people do believe that China has this, because this is not something that China is talking about just now. China has been talking about this since it tested and became an NPT member of the Nuclear Weapons Club. So and then of course, if we go back to Levine's idea of how to make it verifiable, there are ways in which it can be done.
Indeed, I think China is genuine. China, from its military training to its military deployment, I think the idea of waiting to absorb a strike first and then retaliate is deeply embedded in Chinese military thinking and practice. The thing is, both countries don't necessarily trust the other's no first use declaration. So they can first discuss together what constitutes a credible no first use.
Correct.
How does no first use connect with specific capabilities, operational posture, and nuclear authorization procedure?
Force configuration and the
I
rest.
think that generic discussion could be very helpful. Because as you said, yes, as China's capability increases, China increasingly faces the question: how does the credibility of its no first use remains when its weapon capabilities are growing? So I think they can start some initial discussions on generic issues before requiring either side to make new commitments or to changing their existing policy.
Absolutely, and I personally think that, like during the Cold War, there were so many things that the officials on either side, the Soviet Union and the United States, could not really say publicly. So they used pugwash, for instance, to whisper into each other's ears, and that's kind of a process of building up trust. But it was great having you, Professor Zhao. I'm really happy that we could discuss these issues. This is all from this episode. If you're looking for useful policy discussions, subscribe to the CESPA channel. That way you get a heads up on new episodes. Until next time, goodbye and stay safe.